The desert wind carries more than sand. 4,000 years ago, an old man looked at the starry sky and heard a voice that would change the destiny of humanity. I will make you into a great nation. But in that same tent, two women were already at war. Two sons would be born. One would be the chosen one, the other the exiled. And so began the longest war in history. Brother against brother, blood against blood. In their mother's womb, twins already fought for the right to be born first. One grabbed the other's heel, as if he knew that the fate of unborn nations was being decided right there. The older will serve the younger, a sentence that would echo through the centuries in cries of war. 12 tribes, one land, countless enemies all around. But the real enemy was always within, in the tents, in the blood, in the memory that refuses to forgive. Gaza, Jerusalem, the Sinai. Names you know from the news were already battlefields when the pyramids were still young. This is not just ancient history. It is the history that is still being written with blood in the desert. Ur of the Chaldeans, at the dawn of time, when the towers of Babel still challenged the heavens with their enameled bricks that gleamed like jewels under the Mesopotamian sun, and the waters of the great flood were but memory preserved in the songs of the elders, in the alluvial plains where the Euphrates kissed the most fertile soil on earth, lived a man destined to become father of a war that would last until the end of time. Abram contemplated the stars from the terrace of his house in the most prosperous and advanced city of the known world. Ur was not merely a city among others, it was the pulsing center of the civilized universe, where priests dressed in white linen burned incense to stone gods in ziggurats that touched the clouds, where scribes with nimble fingers recorded the secrets of mathematics and astronomy on clay tablets that would survive empires and civilizations. There, merchants weighed gold on bronze scales brought from distant mountains. Caravans arrived laden with spices from mysterious India and precious woods from lands beyond the Red Sea. Libraries guarded knowledge accumulated since the first men learned to cultivate barley on the banks of the twin rivers. It was the jewel of civilization, the place where any sensible man would desire to live and die. But that night, when the constellations danced their eternal dances over the plains, where the first great post-flood civilization had been born, something infinitely greater than all the empires of earth was about to be born in the invisible dimensions that govern the destiny of mortals. Get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. The voice did not echo through the marble corridors of royal palaces. It did not resound from the ziggurats where Nana, the moon god, received sacrifices of unblemished lambs. It did not whisper from temples where Inanna, queen of heaven, was worshipped with dances and libations of sweet wine. It was a voice that seemed to come from beyond the most distant stars, from dimensions where time was merely shadow and space mere illusion created for finite minds. It was the voice that had spoken light to darkness in the beginning of all things, that had separated the waters from the waters when chaos became cosmos, that now chose a 75-year-old man to plant the seeds of conflicts that would make the earth bleed through 100 generations. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. The words burned in the patriarch's heart like red-hot iron touching living flesh. Land, offspring, blessing, great name. Promises that would make future kings move armies across continents and devastate entire cities. Words that would become the source of countless wars through the millennia, because every divine promise made to one man is automatically denial to all other men on earth. Every promised land is land taken from someone who considered it their own. Every blessing poured upon one lineage leaves multitudes of other lineages in the bitter desert of rejection. Every divine choice simultaneously creates the chosen and the rejected, the favored and the forgotten, children of promise and children of wrath. Abram did not know, could not know with his finite mind, that at that moment he was planting the seeds of conflicts that would make the earth bleed for millennia yet unborn. He did not suspect that his obedience would create ancestral wounds that would never completely heal. He did not imagine that from his loins would grow lineages destined for eternal collision, like stars on collision course through the vastness of space. When the sun rose over the hanging gardens of Ur, gilding the waters of the Euphrates that reflected the first rays like liquid mirrors, the decision was made with the firmness of one who had heard the voice of the Creator himself. Abram gathered his family, his countless flocks, his faithful servants, a caravan of hundreds of people and thousands of animals that would abandon the center of known civilization to follow promises that seemed impossible to any sensible observer. Sarai, his 65-year-old wife, closed for the last time the cedar doors of the house where they had lived decades of prosperity and stability. Her womb had been dry for so long that the very idea of offspring, numerous as the stars of the firmament, sounded like cruel mockery from heaven. But there was something in her dark eyes, a fierce determination, a hunger for destiny that transcended common understanding, that would make her not only mother of princes, but root of future wars that would shake the foundations of the earth. Lot, his ambitious nephew with eyes always turned toward opportunities for enrichment, carried his own dreams of greatness while leading his flocks for the last time through the paved streets of Ur. He did not know that his future greed would lead him to choose the dangerous plains of Sodom, becoming progenitor of nations that would one day rise against the children of promise, with hatred distilled through generations. But there was a presence that would go unnoticed, that epic morning of departure, a figure who walked silently among the servants without anyone suspecting the central role she would play in the saga that was beginning. Hagar, Egyptian maid with eyes dark as Nile nights and bearing as stately as Pharaoh's daughters, followed her mistress without suspecting that her virgin womb would carry Abraham's first son, that her unexpected motherhood would plant the first bloody wound in the chosen lineage, that from her blood would be born a nation of wild archers whose hands would rise against all the peoples of the earth. The caravan departed when the sun already burned the street stones, and merchants opened their tents for another day of prosperous trade. Behind them, Ur continued its golden existence, completely unaware that it had just lost the man who carried the future of all nations in hands, hardened by desert life. Merchants continued weighing gold and silver. Priests continued offering sacrifices to stone gods. Scribes continued recording transactions and contracts. None of them perceived that the history of humanity had just taken a turn that would change the destiny of all peoples yet unborn. The journey through the Syrian deserts lasted months that seemed like years. They crossed the arid vastnesses where only experienced caravans dared venture, passed through Damascus where trade routes crossed like pulsing arteries, carrying treasures from all the known world. They climbed the snow-covered slopes of Lebanon's mountains, where millennial cedars whispered secrets to winds descending from the heights. They descended through Syria's green valleys, where ancient cities guarded their own stories of conquest and defeat, of glory and decay. In Haran, at the crossroads between east and west, Terah died as a man who had begun a journey, but had not had enough faith to complete it. Abraham's father was buried far from both the civilization he had left and the promise he had sought. As if the heavens said with crystalline clarity, only those totally committed to the impossible will inherit the impossible. When they finally crossed the Jordan and set foot in Canaan, the land God had shown Abraham in visions that transcended physical dimensions, they discovered a reality that would infinitely complicate the fulfillment of divine promises. The promised land was not empty, waiting for new inhabitants. It already had owners who had considered it theirs for countless generations. Canaanites inhabited the fortified cities with stone walls that challenged any attempt at conquest. Hittites controlled the strategic mountains from where they could observe all movements in the plains. Jebusites dominated the city that would one day be called Jerusalem, building fortresses that seemed impregnable. Philistia controlled the coast where Gaza spread its influence, like a spider's web over maritime trade routes. The divine promise collided frontally with earthly realities that would generate eternal conflicts between those who possessed heavenly promises and those who possessed earthly possession. It was the first harbinger that divine blessings would not be implemented peacefully, but through struggles that would last millennia. But there was something even more disturbing and pregnant, with future consequences happening within Abraham's own tents. Two women measured each other daily with gazes that promised future war, each carrying in her heart ambitions and resentments that would plant the seeds of humanity's most enduring conflicts. Between them hovered a destiny suspended like the sword of Damocles, waiting only for the right moment to descend and divide the world in half. Abraham built his first altar in Shechem, stacking raw stones under a millennial oak that had witnessed centuries of Canaanite history. When holy fire consumed the sacrifice and smoke rose to heaven like materialized prayer, something irreversible was sealed in the fabric of the cosmos. A covenant was established that transcended human contracts. A destiny was decreed that would survive the fall of empires and the birth of civilizations. From that sacred moment, every decision Abraham made would create waves that would spread through the centuries, like stones thrown into a tranquil lake. Every son he begot would plant roots of future conflicts. Every blessing he received would leave others in the shadow of rejection that would transform into ancestral hatred. The desert wind blew through the patriarch's tents on that first night in the Promised Land, carrying more than sand from the surrounding dunes. It carried the echo of wars yet to be fought, of blood yet to be shed, of wounds yet to be opened, of hatreds yet to be born. It carried whispers of destinies that would interweave through millennia like threads in a cosmic tapestry woven by invisible hands. The promise that would divide the world forever had found its earthly home. The seeds of eternal conflict had been planted in the sacred soil of the Promised Land. Now it remained only to wait for them to germinate and grow until they became trees whose fruits would be harvested by future generations. Sweet fruits for some, bitter for others, but always carrying the taste of decisions made by an old man who had the courage to obey a voice that changed humanity's destiny forever. 10 years had passed since they set foot in the Promised Land, 10 years of divine promises echoing like distant thunder, while Sarai's womb remained barren as desert in drought. The silence of her sterility had become a wound that bled with every new moon. "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children," Sarai whispered one night, when the crescent moon resembled an open wound in the firmament. "Please, go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." The words came out like blood from a deep bite. Each syllable carried the weight of a decision that would crack the world in half, planting a seed that would grow into a tree of hatred, whose fruits would be harvested for millennia. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai, 5 words that sealed the destiny of billions. Hagar conceived, and with conception came contempt. The Egyptian maid, carrying the patriarch's firstborn, looked at Sarai with the disdain of one who possesses what the other had always desired. Sarai retaliated with the cruelty of one who feels betrayed by her own decision. In the wilderness of Shur, where Hagar fled from persecution, the angel of the Lord revealed the son's destiny. "And you shall call his name Ishmael. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him." Ishmael was born with sealed destiny. He would be wild, untamable, eternally in conflict. For 13 years he grew as the only heir, strong as a cedar, agile as a gazelle, brave as a lion. He was son of the desert and son of promise simultaneously, but heaven prepared a turn that would break his heart. "Sarah shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant." When Isaac was born, Sarah's laughter echoed like fulfilled prophecy. On the day of weaning, Sarah saw Ishmael mocking the baby half-brother and recognized a harbinger of future conflicts. "Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son." The dawn of expulsion broke red as blood. Abraham put bread and water on Hagar's shoulders, placed his hand on Ishmael's shoulder for the last time. "Go, my son, but remember, I will also make a great nation of you." Ishmael departed without looking back. 16 years old, eyes burning with humiliation and promise of revenge. He carried more than provisions. He carried the wound of rejection that would never heal. In the wilderness of Paran, he became a skillful archer, married an Egyptian woman, begot 12 sons who became princes of tribes. His tents multiplied like sands. His warriors dominated caravans. But at every campfire, a story was retold. How the son of the bondwoman was cast out so the son of the free woman could inherit everything. With each generation, the wound deepened. In the Zagros Mountains, long before Ishmael was born, Elam was begetting sons destined to build empires. He was Shem's firstborn, the first to breathe the air of the post-flood world. By divine right, he should lead all Semitic nations. When Shem's sons scattered, Elam ascended to the rocky heights, building there an altar to the God who had saved his family from the waters. His descendants became warriors forged in stone, feared archers, kings of trade routes. Susa grew as a jewel in the mountains, with palaces touching clouds and treasures that would make pharaohs weep with envy. But disturbing news arrived. An Elamite merchant brought impossible stories. There is a man in Canaan who claims to have heard the voice of the supreme God. He says his descendants will inherit lands from the Nile to the Euphrates. He says he will be father of nations. Chedorlaomer, king of Elam from the royal line, felt his blood boil. How dare a descendant of Arphaxad, Elam's younger brother, claim blessings that by right of primogeniture belong to Shem's firstborn? Let us show this Abraham who really rules the lands between the rivers, he declared to the allied kings. For 14 years, the eastern kings dominated the cities of the plain, collecting tribute, establishing supremacy. It was clear demonstration. See who controls these lands. In the 15th year, the cities rebelled. Chedorlaomer descended from the mountains with a coalition that made the earth tremble. They crushed giants at Ashtaroth Karnaim, destroyed Zuzim at Ham, annihilated Emim in the plain. In Sodom, they captured Lot. It was the awaited moment to force the patriarch to bow. But Abraham did not bow. With 318 trained men, he pursued the Elamite army to Dan. At dawn, he divided his men and attacked from all directions. When the sun rose, Chedorlaomer was dead. His armies scattered, Lot was free. It was more than military victory. It was cosmic humiliation. Shem's firstborn had been defeated by a nomad with 300 servants. The Elamite empire broken by a shepherd of sheep. In the Zagros Mountains, survivors told and retold the story of defeat. The seed of resentment was planted and watered with Elamite blood. Future generations would grow up hearing about the great humiliation, about how heaven had chosen the younger over the elder. The Elamites became Medes, who became Persians, who would build the greatest empire on earth. But in every royal palace, an ancestral memory would pulse. Chedorlaomer dead in the desert because of a god who favored the younger over the older. Elam's wound, like Ishmael's, would deepen through the centuries. Every military victory would recall the ancient defeat. Every territorial expansion would clash with the memory that there was a people in the world who possessed promises superior to Persian conquests. Two wounds were opened in the world's childhood: Ishmael's, the rejected son, and Elam's, the despised firstborn. Two lineages with reasons to hate Isaac's sons. Two promises of war that would echo through the millennia. From that day in Dan, when Elamite blood stained the Jordan's waters, destiny was sealed. Elam's descendants would never forget, never forgive, never cease seeking opportunity to reverse that ancestral humiliation. The roots of blood were planted, the rival lineages defined, the reasons for perpetual war established forever. Now it was only a matter of time until the ancient wounds generated new battles. The night Jacob wrestled with the angel at the banks of Jabbok was when the destiny of 12 future nations was sealed in a single supernatural battle. When the sun rose and the patriarch limped from his dislocated hip, he was no longer Jacob the supplanter. He was Israel, he who prevailed with God. But the blessing that transformed a man into father of nations carried within itself the seeds of future divisions that would make the lineage of promise bleed by its own hands. 4 mothers, 12 sons, countless reasons for jealousy. Leah, the despised, bore sons in the bitterness of one competing for love, never fully received. Rachel, the beloved, bore sons in the sweetness of one who possesses the husband's heart, but suffers from barrenness. The maids Bilhah and Zilpah bore sons in the ambiguity of those who serve other women's dreams. Joseph, the dreamer of colorful coats, would be sold by his own brothers because his dreams revealed a supremacy they could not accept. "Look, this dreamer is coming," they mocked before throwing him into the pit. "Come, let us kill him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But Joseph's dreams did not die in the pit. They multiplied like stars. They became prophecies that would be fulfilled in Egypt, where the sold would become savior, where the rejected would become viceroy, where the despised would become instrument of preservation for the entire family. For 400 years, Israel's children grew in Egypt as one nation. The 12 tribes multiplied together in Goshen's plains, suffered together under pharaonic slavery, were freed together by the hand that divided the Red Sea. But when they returned to the promised land under Joshua, ancient divisions awakened like buried seeds, finding water after long drought. The division of land among the 12 tribes was more than geographical arrangement. It was harbinger of political fragmentation that would tear Israel apart when it most needed unity against Eastern empires. Judah received the southern lands, including future Jerusalem, establishing supremacy that other tribes would never accept. Joseph, through Ephraim and Manasseh, controlled the central lands, creating a power pole that would rival Judah. Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh chose to remain beyond the Jordan, creating the first geographical division that would become political and spiritual. During the Judges, when each tribe did what was right in its own eyes, fractures deepened. The bloodiest war was against Benjamin because of Gibeah's crime. 11 tribes almost exterminated the 12th. None of us will give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin. When Samuel anointed David to replace Saul, tribal divisions transformed into declared civil war, and there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. For 7 years, Israel bled by its own hands, while Philistines observed the self-destruction of the chosen people. David unified the tribes through force. Solomon consolidated through the temple's magnificence. But when Rehoboam ascended the throne, tensions exploded. "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke." The response was immediate. "What share have we in David? To your tents, O Israel." The kingdom split like a torn veil. 10 tribes followed Jeroboam, forming the northern kingdom. 2 remained faithful to Rehoboam, forming the southern kingdom. The division was theological. Jeroboam established alternative cults with golden calves, losing spiritual legitimacy. Judah maintained Jerusalem and the true temple, but was numerically inferior. In Nineveh's courts, Tiglath-Pileser III contemplated maps showing small divided nations between Mediterranean and Jordan. "Israel and Judah," he murmured. "Once a united nation that humiliated our ancestors, now 2 weak kingdoms devouring each other." The irony did not escape Assyrian strategists. The people who had sent Abraham with 300 men to humiliate Chedorlaomer was so divided, it barely defended borders against nomadic raids. The division had been like music to ancient enemies' ears. For 200 years, since Rehoboam and Jeroboam tore apart Solomon's kingdom, descendants of all those humiliated by the Hebrews watched with satisfaction the self-destruction of the chosen nation. In the northern kingdom, political instability became endemic. Dynasty after dynasty arose and disappeared in bloody coups. Ahab married Jezebel and brought Baal's apostasy, strategic suicide that deprived Israel of the only advantage that had made it superior to empires. The Assyrians were the first to attack. In 734, Tiglath-Pileser invaded and led captive the tribes beyond Jordan. Shalmaneser besieged Samaria for 3 years. Sargon completed the conquest and deported the 10 remaining tribes. The king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away to Assyria. The northern kingdom had ceased to exist. 10 of the 12 tribes became lost tribes who would never return. The promised land was being redistributed to foreign peoples, cosmic inversion of the original promise. Judah survived by miracle. When Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem with 185,000 soldiers, Hezekiah entered the temple. The answer came through Isaiah. "He shall not come into this city, for I will defend this city for David's sake." That night, the angel of the Lord struck 185,000 Assyrians. Sennacherib fled and was assassinated by his own sons. It was an echo of Abraham's victory over Chedorlaomer. Again, Israel's God humiliated Shem's descendants, but it would be the last great demonstration that would save Israel from ancestral enemies. The flames that consumed Solomon's temple rose like lamentation through the millennia. Nebuchadnezzar contemplated the destruction of the city that for 500 years had been the spiritual center of the chosen people. And he burned the house of the Lord and the king's house. All the houses of Jerusalem he burned with fire. Physical destruction was only the beginning of a dispersion that would fulfill both divine judgment and ancestral vengeance. The people of promise would be scattered to the 4 winds, exactly as Abraham had scattered Chedorlaomer's armies. Daniel, taken in the first exile, became royal counselor. When Nebuchadnezzar saw the 4th man in the furnace, like the Son of God, he declared, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," involuntarily fulfilling, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." With Zedekiah's revolt came complete destruction, and he carried away those who escaped from the sword to Babylon. At the banks of Babylonian rivers, where exiles hung their harps on willows, something extraordinary happened. Judaism transformed from national religion into universal faith that would survive without temple, without land, without sacrifices. Synagogues were born as temple substitutes. Scribes preserved scriptures with devotion that transformed every word into sacred treasure. Dispersion created networks of Jews connected across vast distances. It was paradox. The attempt to destroy the people resulted in its exponential multiplication. Each exiled community became seed of new communities. But there was a dark side. In every generation in exile, Jews were forced to interact with descendants of Ishmael and Elam. At every encounter, ancestral wounds were remembered and deepened. Ishmael's wound pulsed in interactions between Jews and Arabs in Damascus markets. Elam's wound manifested in Persian administrators' subtle hostility. These were not just bureaucratic difficulties, they were manifestations of ancestral resistance. The dispersion had created a paradoxical situation. It had spread Abraham's seed throughout the known world, but had put Jews in constant contact with carriers of ancestral wounds. It was as if every new Jewish community became living reminder of humiliations suffered by rival lineages. The wounds had not healed with time. They had deepened through forced proximity. The dispersion that should have eliminated Israel as political factor had transformed the ancestral conflict from war between nations into permanent tension between mixed peoples. The next phase of the ancestral saga was about to begin. In the inner chambers of Susa's palace, where marble columns supported golden ceilings that reflected the glory of the greatest empire Earth had ever known, Haman contemplated a genealogical scroll dating over 1,000 years. His fingers traced lineages connecting his royal blood to Elamite kings who ruled Zagros Mountains when Babylon was still a shepherd's village. Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, descendant of Agag, exterminated by Saul, but there were deeper layers in ancestry, matrimonial alliances between Amalek's royal houses and Elam's surviving princes. Elamite blood flowed in his veins like ancestral poison, inherited from political marriages that had united all lineages with reasons to hate Abraham's descendants. In Haman converged Chedorlaomer's humiliation, Agag's wrath exterminated by Saul, and the millennial resentment of all those who saw in Jews living, reminder of their own ancestral defeats. When Ahasuerus elevated him above all court princes, placing his seat above all kingdom officers' seats, it was not just recognition of administrative merit. It was cosmic alignment of forces that for over 1,000 years had awaited opportunity to settle the account Abraham had left open when he humiliated Chedorlaomer's armies. And all the king's servants bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded. But there was one man who remained upright like Lebanon's cedar when all bowed. Mordecai, son of Jair of Benjamin's tribe, carried in his blood memory of Israel's kings and dignity of those chosen for blessing before the world was created. It was not personal pride that prevented him from bowing. It was instinctive recognition that his lineage possessed promises transcending temporal political hierarchies. "Why do you transgress the king's command?" the gate servants asked him day after day. "I am a Jew," Mordecai replied. And in those 3 words lay the entire history of a people who had learned to stand upright before empires because they knew their authority came from dimensions superior to earthly politics. Haman's fury, when he discovered Mordecai's ethnic identity, went beyond common personal rage. It was eruption of millennial hatred, finally finding escape valve after centuries of silent fermentation. It was not enough to destroy only Mordecai. It was necessary to exterminate his entire race, all the people who carried the blood of promise that had humiliated his ancestors. There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Haman whispered in Ahasuerus' ear during private audience, words dripping refined poison through generations of resentment. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. It was calculated accusation to awaken imperial paranoia. Haman presented Jews not as another ethnic minority, but as dangerous fifth column maintaining loyalties alternative to the state. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasuries. 10,000 talents. astronomical sum representing years of imperial revenue. Haman was offering to pay from his own pocket for the privilege of executing ancestral vengeance that 1,000 years of humiliation had made family obsession. Ahasuerus, intoxicated by absolute power and ignorant of the cosmic intrigue unfolding in his palace, gave Haman his signet ring. The money and the people are given to you, to do with them as seems good to you. The first systematic genocide decree in history was about to be written, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day. The chosen date was not random. Haman had cast sacred lots, before the gods he worshipped, seeking the day when spiritual forces would be aligned for ancestral vengeance. 11 months of preparation to savor in anticipation the revenge that generations of humiliated ancestors had dreamed. When the decree was proclaimed in Susa's citadel, something extraordinary happened that demonstrated the cosmic dimension of what was being planned. Heaven itself seemed to darken in broad daylight. The city was disturbed, confused, and troubled. Even Gentiles perceived that something greater than politics was in motion. And the city of Susa was perplexed, recorded the chronicler. Mordecai received the news and tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, crying with a loud and bitter cry. It was not just personal lamentation. It was the cry of a lineage recognizing it faced the decisive moment of its existence. In the perfumed gardens of the royal harem, where marble fountains whispered Persian melodies and peacocks walked among rose bushes, a young orphan contemplated her people's destiny with weight no crown should bear. Hadassah, this was her Hebrew name, had been brought to the palace years before during the imperial search for a new queen. Now crowned as Esther, queen of Earth's greatest empire, she carried in her hands the future of her entire race. The irony was so deep it seemed orchestrated by superior dimensions. At the exact moment Haman planned total extermination of Jews, a Jewish woman occupied the world's most powerful throne. But there were mortal complexities. Esther had hidden her Jewish identity on Mordecai's orders. For 5 years she had lived as Persian in the palace, her survival depending on a lie so fundamental that revealing it would mean not only loss of status but possibly execution. Moreover, imperial protocol made any unauthorized approach to the king an act punishable by death. Any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter. For 30 days Ahasuerus had not called Esther. Approaching meant betting life on hope he would extend the scepter, instead of ordering immediate execution. When Mordecai appealed through eunuchs, he sent a message that would change history. Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The question echoed through golden corridors. Would Esther be the instrument chosen by heaven to break the millennial curse? The answer revealed transformation of assimilated youth into ancestral heroine. Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. For 3 days and nights Esther fasted in preparation for the moment that would define not only her personal destiny, but Abraham's lineage's future. It was mystical connection with all women of her ancestry who had faced impossible moments. On the 3rd day, Esther put on royal robes and went to the inner court. Every step was between life and death. When Ahasuerus saw her, it was as if he contemplated divine apparition. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter. What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom. But Esther was wise beyond her years. Destiny is not resolved in single movement, but in dance where each step prepares the next. If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. 2 banquets. 2 opportunities for Haman to hang himself in his own arrogance. Haman went out from the first banquet, joyful and with a glad heart, convinced he possessed the queen's special favor. Intoxicated by approval, he ordered construction of a 50-cubit gallows to publicly execute Mordecai. But that night, sleep fled from the king. Then the king said to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles. In dusty pages was found record of how Mordecai had saved the royal life by discovering conspiracy, never having been rewarded. Surgical timing too much for coincidence. On the night Haman built gallows for Mordecai, the king discovered he owed his life to the same man. When Haman came eagerly to ask permission to hang Mordecai, he found a question that would explode his presumption. What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Certain it referred to him, Haman suggested maximum possible honor. The response was like lightning. Hurry, take the robe and the horse and do so for Mordecai the Jew. The humiliation was absolute. Haman was forced to publicly honor the one who had refused to bow. The echo of Chedorlaomer's ancient defeat resurfaced like vengeful ghost. At the second banquet, Esther revealed her cards. Let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request, for we have been sold to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Who is he? The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. The terror that seized Haman was more than fear of death. It was recognition that he had been outplayed in a game he thought he controlled. Before him stood the queen he had courted, and she was Jewish. 1,000 years of ancestral vengeance crumbling in a single moment. Hang him on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. The 50-cubit gallows Haman had built to hang the Jew became instrument of his own destruction. The vengeance that 1,000 years of hatred had planned turned against its own architects. It was more than political justice. It was judgment of every attempt to exterminate the people through whom all nations would be blessed. It was demonstration that Abraham's God's promises possessed power superior to any human conspiracy. The first coordinated attempt at final solution had failed through an orphan who had courage to risk everything at the right moment. The first direct confrontation between rival lineages had ended with impossible victory of Abraham's descendants over Elam's descendants. But the Ancestral War had only changed battlefields. Babylon's walls were considered impregnable, 90 meters high, 20 wide, built with enameled bricks that gleamed like sapphires under the Mesopotamian sun. For generations, kings and conquerors looked at those towers and abandoned their conquest dreams before even drawing swords. But in the plains before Ishtar's golden gates, a different army prepared for the impossible. It was not just that they possessed superior numbers or advanced military technology. There was something in their commander's eyes, suggesting he carried authority superior to brute force. Cyrus, king of Persia and the Medes, direct descendant of Elam through royal lines reaching back to Zagros Mountains, rode before his troops as if he were more than mortal man. But there was paradox in his person that defied all ancestral logic. He was simultaneously heir to Elam's millennial wound and chosen instrument of Abraham's God to liberate the people of promise. In Babylonian palaces' damp cellars, where Jewish scribes copied sacred scrolls by flickering lamplight, an aged prophet named Daniel contemplated visions that would challenge all human understanding. For 70 years he had served in imperial power corridors, interpreting kings' dreams and decreeing nations' destinies. Cyrus's name had been mentioned by heaven 200 years before his birth. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, Prophet Isaiah had written 2 centuries earlier, when the Persian Empire did not even exist yet, whose right hand I have held to subdue nations before him. Anointed, Mashiach, Messiah, a Persian king, descendant of those humiliated by Abraham, receiving the most sacred title Jews knew. It was as if destiny itself was contorting upon itself, creating impossible bonds between lineages that should be eternal enemies. Babylon's fall was more than military victory. It was prophetic fulfillment that echoed through dimensions. Belshazzar had profaned Jerusalem temple's sacred vessels during a feast when mysterious hand wrote on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Daniel had interpreted the writing. The kingdom had been weighed and found wanting, divided and given to Medes and Persians. That very night, exactly as predicted, Babylon fell. But the conquest method revealed something extraordinary about Cyrus's character. Instead of devastating the city that had resisted for months, he entered as liberator. Instead of plundering temples and massacring population, he proclaimed general amnesty and restitution of all exiled peoples to their original lands. All captive peoples return to their lands, he declared in his first imperial edict. All exiled gods returned to their temples. It was revolutionary policy that completely inverted the imperial pattern established since Sargon of Akkad. But for Jews, he reserved special decree that would echo through eternity. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, "The Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you of all his people? May his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem." It was more than political permission. It was theological recognition that Israel's God possessed supreme authority over all other empire gods. Cyrus was not just freeing exiles. He was publicly confessing that his own authority derived from the God who had humiliated his ancestors. 42,000 Jews responded to the call. Zerubbabel led the first caravan, carrying not only personal hopes, but messianic expectations. Ezra organized the second migration wave, focused on spiritual reconstruction through Mosaic law restoration. In ox carts, winding through deserts toward the Promised Land, carefully protected by Persian guards, went the temple's sacred vessels, 5,400 utensils of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar had plundered 70 years before. The procession ascending from Babylon to Jerusalem was more than exodus. It was national resurrection. A people who were dead as political entity returned to life. A nation that had been scattered like ashes to the wind, reunified. And all this by the hands of an Elam descendant. Cyrus not only permitted reconstruction, he financed it generously. From Persian royal treasury came tons of gold and silver specifically destined to re-erect Solomon's temple. Lebanon cedars were cut and transported across the empire by imperial order. Phoenician craftsmen were hired and paid by Persian treasury. It was as if Elam's ancestral wound had miraculously transformed into healing balm. The blood that for 1,000 years had cried for vengeance against Abraham's descendants was now paying for restoration of their spiritual capital. During his reign's final years, Cyrus became student of Hebrew scriptures, seeking to understand the God who had chosen him as instrument despite his pagan origin. He maintained Jewish scribes in his personal court. He regularly consulted on questions affecting Jews' welfare throughout the empire. When he died in battle against Mesopotamia, he left legacy that defied all ancestral logic. He had been the greatest benefactor the Jewish people ever had, greater even than many of their own kings. For the first time in 1,000 years, an Elam descendant had found peace with Abraham's descendants through voluntary submission to the God of promise. But it would only be temporary parenthesis in the Ancestral War. Cambyses II, Cyrus's son, awoke every night with the same nightmare that would torment his dynasty until its end. He saw his father before foreign altar, bowed before God who was not Persian, offering ancestors gold to build strangers' temples. The dream always ended with Elam's voice echoing from Zagros mountains. "Why do you honor the sons of those who humiliated me? Why do you strengthen the lineage that shamed our ancestral house?" The transformation began gradual, almost imperceptible, like gangrene spreading through apparently healed wound. First were small delays in releasing promised resources for Jerusalem's reconstruction. Imperial officials discovered irregularities in material requests. Bureaucrats created new procedures that transformed simple processes into administrative labyrinths consuming months. Then came creative reinterpretations of Cyrus's decrees. Imperial scribes found legal ambiguities, allowing limitation of Jewish privileges without technically revoking original concessions. Provincial governors received verbal instructions contradicting written orders. Ancestral memory was awakening like sleeping beasts smelling ancient blood. It was not just kings changing, it was the entire imperial apparatus. In Zoroastrian magi schools, young priests studied ancient genealogies and asked uncomfortable questions. Why did our great king Cyrus favor Jews above all other exiled peoples? Why did he rebuild only their temple with imperial resources? Answers came in palace corridor whispers. Do you remember the ancient stories? Chedorlaomer, our royal ancestor, was humiliated by Abraham with only 300 men. Haman, our cousin, was hanged for trying to avenge that humiliation. But instead of generating reverence, this perception fed even deeper resentment. If Jews had supernatural protection, then supernatural strategy would be necessary to neutralize them. If heaven favored promised children, then it would be necessary to invoke powers of darkness to balance the scale. Cambyses died mysteriously during Egyptian campaign. Zoroastrian magi usurped the throne for months, proclaiming a Achaemenid dynasty had lost divine favor for favoring foreign peoples. Darius I the Great consolidated power through bloody civil war, leaving deep scars in imperial structure. Each transition brought new advisors, new priests, new interpretation of Persian responsibilities toward exiled peoples. Great Cyrus was too generous, Darius murmured in private councils, surrounded by nobles bearing Elamite names and ancestral memories. Allowing exiled peoples to return to their lands was wise policy, but financing their reconstructions with our gold, that was excessive. Transformation accelerated dramatically during Xerxes' reign, when royal advisors, many direct descendants of clans that had served Haman, constantly whispered in imperial ear doctrines, transforming generosity into paranoia. Majesty, they argued during nocturnal audiences, Jews are not loyal subjects like other peoples. They maintain their own laws, frequently contradicting imperial laws. They refuse to fully integrate into Persian culture. Paranoia's seed found fertile soil in Xerxes' heart. A man who had seen his million-man army humiliated by 300 Spartans at Thermopylae was psychologically prepared to believe any conspiracy. The first anti-Jewish edict since Haman was subtle. For imperial security reasons, pilgrimages to Jerusalem will be temporarily limited. The second was more direct. Royal treasury contributions for foreign religious projects will be suspended. The third was clearly hostile. Empire subjects maintaining dual loyalties will be considered suspicious. In Jerusalem, reconstruction works that had progressed magnificently under Cyrus began withering like plants deprived of water. Promised materials never arrived. Contracted craftsmen were reallocated to more urgent imperial projects. Ancestral War was reasserting supremacy over temporary generosity Cyrus had demonstrated. In Persian Magi academies, new theology was being formulated. If Ahura Mazda was light's supreme god, and if Jews worshipped different divinity, then logically they worshipped darkness entity disguised as light. They are Ahriman's servants, they declared in sermons echoing through fire temples. That's why Cyrus was temporarily blinded by their enchantments. The transformation was complete. In 2 generations, the empire that had freed Jews from Babylonian exile had again become their systematic oppressor. Elam's blood had resumed its true nature, eternally opposed to Abraham's blood. The paradox was resolved through natural order restoration. Cyrus had been cosmic anomaly, moment when destiny hesitated before resuming inevitable course. But ancestral law was stronger than any royal decree. Elam's sons were destined to hate promised sons. The empire that once freed Israel was preparing to become instrument of its final destruction. The next war would not just be between rival nations, it would be between ancestral destinies finally finding their definitive resolution. Among mud huts of Jewish exiles at muddy banks of Chebar River, where willows wept dew tears and wind carried echoes of homeland lost for decades, a man contemplated visions that would make emperors tremble and prophets of all nations question their most sacred oracles. Ezekiel, son of Buzi, Levitical priest torn from Jerusalem by Babylonian eagles when only 25, received from the eternal panoramas of wars that would unfold when his bones were already dust mixed with Mesopotamian sands for countless millennia. Son of man, echoed the voice commanding celestial spheres and moving constellations in eternal orbits. Set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. The prophet raised weary eyes beyond linear time dimensions, transcending human perception limitations, and saw scenes that would challenge any mortal mind, untouched by divine revelation. He saw countless armies descending like storm clouds to cover Earth, their ranks extending beyond visible horizon, like infinite sea of gleaming steel and iron. He saw horsemen, whose horses breathed steam like dragons of ancient legends, and whose weapons glowed with fire, clearly not of this material world. He saw nations not yet existing, even in embryo, uniting in supernatural confederation of hatred against people still struggling to survive at foreign river margins. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet, continued celestial revelation. each word simultaneously engraved in earthly scroll before the prophet and in eternal destiny tablets governing human history's course. Gomer and all its troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops, many people are with you. Persia, the name burned in the prophet's expanded mind like red-hot iron touching living flesh, leaving mark that would never fade. There it was, crystal clear in divine visions, transcending time and space, specific as military map drawn by Supreme General. Elam's descendants would march against the restored land of Abraham's sons. It would not be passing geopolitical coincidence. It would not be common territorial dispute between neighboring peoples. It would be inexorable fulfillment of destiny, written in eternity's tablets, before first stars sang their creation hymns. Now it will come to pass in the latter days, continued the voice that had spoken entire worlds into existence with simple words, that you will come against the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. Ezekiel saw beyond centuries like eagle, soaring over invisible time currents, simultaneously contemplating past, present, and future, in perspective only eternity-touched minds can reach. He saw Israel's land desolate for millennia, transformed into sterile wasteland where only ghosts of dead civilizations wandered among ruins covered by oblivion's sand. He saw its children scattered like wind-carried seeds to known and unknown Earth's four corners. He saw persecutions that would make even stone hearts bleed with compassion, exiles that would seem to last entire eternities, systematic extermination attempts repeating through centuries like evil waves relentlessly beating against divine promise, rocks refusing to be eroded. But he also saw in dramatic contrast the absolutely impossible return, dry and bleached bones gaining sinews, muscles, flesh and skin in resurrection, defying all known natural laws. Entire valleys of death and desolation blooming into gardens of abundant life. An entire nation being born in single day, like woman giving birth before even feeling first labor pains. And he saw, with terrifying clarity, what would come immediately after that miraculous national resurrection. You will ascend, coming like a storm, covering the land like a cloud, you and all your troops and many peoples with you. The vision was too sharp for poetic allegory, too specific for abstract spiritual symbol. Persia, the empire not even existing when prophecy was given to exiles, being nothing more than nomadic tribes scattered in Zagros's frozen mountains, would be main protagonist in human history's final drama. In actual Persian palace courts where Ezekiel had prophesied decades before, another seer would complement visions with precision, making even most skilled astronomers envy his mathematical accuracy. Daniel, Ezekiel's cousin in bitter Babylonian exile, intimate counselor of Babylonian and Persian kings through decades of faithful service, contemplated his own apocalyptic revelations in polished marble halls of Susa and perfumed hanging gardens of Babylon. His visions were more precise than most detailed navigation charts, more exact than astronomical calendars most elaborated by Chaldean magi. 4 great beasts came up from the sea. Daniel saw in dreams, making Earth's most powerful men appear helpless marionettes, dancing to celestial music they could neither hear nor understand. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. A second, like a bear raised up on one side, as another, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. A fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong with huge iron teeth. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. The 4 empires that would successively dominate inhabited Earth were being revealed with centuries of anticipation, their distinctive characteristics and supremacy periods described with precision that would make other nations' prophets completely mute with envy and admiration. But there was something even more impressive and disturbing in Daniel's visions. Militarily exact description of how ancient ancestral conflicts would definitively resolve in final days. And in the days of these kings, declared revelation concerning 4th terrible beast and its 10 mysterious horns, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Prophetic pattern was being established, with mathematical clarity defying any possibility of misunderstanding. There would be final and definitive confederation of all ancestral enemies marching united against promise people. All ancient wounds that had bled through millennia would open simultaneously like volcanoes awakening after eras of deceptive dormancy. All vengeances carefully postponed through generations would finally be executed in coordination, completely transcending any purely human planning. Ishmael and his indomitable tribes scattered across infinite deserts, Elam and his successive empires controlling strategic eastern mountains, all lineages feeling unjustly rejected when Abraham was chosen by heaven would march together in last and definitive effort to completely erase from earth those carrying original promise blood. But it would simultaneously be a moment of definitive and eternal resolution, and it will come to pass at the same time, continued Ezekiel, receiving tactical details that would make modern generals pause in admiration for strategic precision. When Gog comes against the land of Israel, that my fury will show in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath I have spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. Hopham's final battle would be cosmic in scale and completely supernatural in execution. Not only terrestrial armies with conventional weapons, but nature's fundamental forces themselves would dramatically enter conflict. Earthquakes would crack entire continents like fragile paper. Mountains would be overthrown and leveled like simple sand castles. The firmament itself would tremble like delicate veil shaken by gigantic invisible hands. And I will call for a sword against Gog throughout all my mountains, declared the Eternal through ecstatic prophet. Every man's sword will be against his brother, and I will bring him to judgment with pestilence and bloodshed. I will rain down on him, on his troops, and on the many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire, and brimstone. It would be victory so absolute and transcendent, it would completely surpass any normal military understanding or conventional strategic analysis. Confederate invaders would not simply be defeated through superior tactics. They would be totally annihilated by forces unequivocally demonstrating that promise. Children's protection came from dimensions infinitely superior to terrestrial ones. Thus, I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. Apocalyptic battle's final result would be universal and incontestable recognition that Abraham's God was truly supreme over all other powers, whether terrestrial or celestial, temporal or eternal. It would be public and definitive validation of all seemingly impossible promises made to solitary patriarch in simple desert tents millennia before. Prophetic visions were complete in all essential details. Future had been revealed with precision that would challenge skeptics through all coming centuries. Bloody wounds opened in Abraham's humble tents would finally find their definitive healing in battle, making all previous history wars seem mere, insignificant skirmishes. Millennial Ancestral Saga's last chapter had been written by inspired prophets. Now it remained only to patiently wait for inexorable time to transform it into inescapable reality. The saga came to its end, but history continues echoing through the ages. 4,000 years have passed since an old man looked at stars and heard voice that would divide humanity forever. 4,000 years since two women measured each other with war gazes in desert tent. 4,000 years since one son was expelled so another could inherit promises that would move nations. And still today, in lands where everything began, the same wind that blew through Abraham's tents continues carrying echoes of that first decision that planted seeds of all future conflicts. Wounds opened in those ancestral days never healed. They only transformed, adapted, manifested through new generations and new circumstances, but always carrying at core the same original pain. Pain of rejection, pain of humiliation, pain of seeing others receive what one considers rightfully one's own. Ishmael fulfilled exactly the destiny prophesied to him in Beersheba's sands. He became great nation. His tents multiplied like stars. His sons dominated routes linking continents. From tribes born of his rejection arose caliphates that shone like desert jewels, emirates controlling wealth flow between worlds, kingdoms making earth tremble under hooves of horses swifter than wind. But expulsion's wound passed from father to son like sacred inheritance. Each generation, story of brother banished so other could inherit everything, was retold with fervor, transforming memory into mission, pain into purpose, ancestral injustice into divine calling to restore lost balance. Elam also followed script traced by his destiny. From mountains where his sons learned to forge iron and tame wild horses, arose Medes who became Persians, who built empires extending from Mediterranean shores to Indus springs. Susa became center of civilized world. Persepolis challenged heavens with pillars seeming to support stars themselves. But Chedorlaomer's humiliation echoed through each generation, like ghost refusing to find rest. Every military victory recalled ancient, inexplicable defeat. Every territorial expansion clashed with memory that there was people in world possessing promises superior to any earthly conquest. Cyrus's paradox, Elam's descendant who became Jews' liberator, was only parentheses in much larger narrative. His generosity was like temporary spring in millennial winter, moment when ancestral wounds seemed to heal, but soon reopened with redoubled force, when his successors remembered where they really came from and who they really were. Israel's internal divisions, 12 tribes fragmenting into rival kingdoms, only served to facilitate ancestral enemies' work. It was as if promise itself carried within its seed of its near destruction, testing to limit faithfulness of one who made it. Exile scattered promise people to Earth's four corners, literally fulfilling prophecy they would be blessing to all nations, but they also put them in permanent contact with descendants of all lineages having reasons to hate Abraham's memory. Haman was only first of many who would attempt to resolve through systematic genocide the problem ancestral wounds represented. His attempt failed because Orphan had courage to risk everything at right moment, but hatred motivating him survived his death and continued fermenting through centuries. Ezekiel's and Daniel's prophecies were not just theological exercises. They were precise maps of future conflicts, anticipatory descriptions of geopolitical alignments, making perfect sense to anyone understanding true roots of animosity between nations. Persia, in latter days, will come against land restored from sword. Words written 2,500 years ago, when Persia were only nomadic tribes in mountains, when Israel were only exiles weeping at Babylonian riverbanks, when idea of nation resurrecting after millennia of death seemed impossible even to prophets believing in impossible. And today, in headlines dominating world news, in Security Council emergency meetings, in bunkers where military strategists calculate conflict scenarios, same ancient words echo with precision, making skeptics question their own convictions. Wars we see unfolding in lands where Abraham built his first altars are not accidents of modern history. They are not disputes over natural resources or contemporary ideological divergences. They are not conflicts beginning with oil discovery or Ottoman Empire collapse. They are inevitable fulfillment of destiny sealed when sterile woman offered her maid to husband and two lineages were born destined for eternal collision. They are echoes of wound opened when firstborn was humiliated by 300 servants of nomadic patriarch and swore that one day account would be settled. They are modern manifestations of hatreds distilled through 100 generations, purified by suffering, refined by memory, transmitted from father to son as inheritance more precious than gold or lands. When missiles cross skies between mountains, where Elam begot his first sons, and hills where Isaac learned to walk, they are not just projectiles carrying explosives. They are war cries echoing from Abraham's tents. They are laments of wounds bleeding silently through millennia. They are echoes of humiliations never avenged and promises never fulfilled. When laboratories hidden in Persian mountain depths worked to develop weapons that could sweep entire cities from Earth's face, they are not just producing modern warfare instruments. They are forging vengeance Elam's wound, carried through 4,000 years of patient waiting. When soldiers patrol borders demarcated by contemporary political agreements, but actually following lines traced by promises made to old man under stars, they are not just defending national territory. They are guarding inheritance that transformed nomad into father of countless multitudes. And if ancient prophets truly saw through veils separating present and future, then what we witness today are only opening chords of final symphony. Crescendo is yet to come, moment when all ancestral wounds will open simultaneously, and Ishmael and Elam will march together in rejected firstborn's last attempt to take what they always considered theirs by divine right. But it will also be moment of definitive resolution, forever closing saga that began in desert tents. Wind blowing today through lands where everything began carries more than sand from millennial dunes. It carries memories of promises dividing human history. It carries echoes of wounds transforming personal rejections into civilizational missions. It carries whispers of prophecies still awaiting final fulfillment. This is not just ancient history, it is last chapter of saga, beginning when world was still young and old man had courage to leave everything, to follow voice promising impossibles. Desert wind blows, and history awaits its denouement in hands of one who made first promise.